Hello everyone and welcome to this Green Cities webinar, Should Communities Have a Right to Green Space? My name's Julia Thrift and I'm the Director of Healthier Placemaking at the Town and Country Planning Association, and we're delivering the UK elements of the Green Cities project. The Green Cities is a campaign to raise awareness of the many benefits of parks, green spaces, plants and green infrastructure. It's funded by the Consumers Health, Agriculture and Food Agency of the EU, and we're delighted to be part of this project that's running across 7 EU countries to promote the benefits of green spaces and green infrastructure. This is the 4th webinar we've held in the series, and the 5th webinar we've held in this series, and we're really pleased that today we're going to be able to talk about the topic of should communities have a right to green space. It's an idea that I think perhaps a couple of years ago would have seemed rather strange to have a right to green space. But now, since we've all lived through lockdown, the immense importance of having green spaces in our neighbourhoods close to where we live has become only too apparent. So it gives me great pleasure today to have 3 fantastic speakers. We're going to start with Caroline Lucas, the MP for Brighton Pavilion, who has been putting forward the idea of a community right to green space, which has since been taken up by a number of other organisations. We then have Helen Griffiths from Fields in Trust, and Trina Linsky, who's a London Green Space Commissioner and Chair of Deptford Folk. So a fantastic different range of perspectives. So this isn't a debate. We don't have one person saying communities should have a right to green space and somebody else disagreeing. But what we're going to do today is to explore this idea from a number of different perspectives. So we're very pleased to have so many delegates here today. We've got more than 100 and more people joining as I speak. So welcome all of you. We hope that you'll have lots of questions. As you'll see from the agenda, we'll put questions to the speakers at the end of this webinar after they've given their presentations. So if you have any questions, please would you type them into the question and answer box, which you can access via the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. We will then collate the questions and put them to the speakers at the end. But do feel free to type in your questions as you think of them. Don't wait to the end of the session. You can also use the chat facility, but we won't be monitoring it. So if you put a question in there, it might get missed, but feel free if you have a comment or would like to share a link with someone, please do add it into the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Caroline Lucas. Caroline was the Green Party's first MP and has represented Brighton Pavilion since 2010. Previously, she served as an MEP for 11 years and as an Oxfordshire councillor. She's a very active parliamentarian and, among other roles, is chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Climate Change and a member of Parliament's Environmental Audit Committee. And she's consistently been voted the UK's most ethical politician. So a warm welcome to you, Caroline. Thank you for joining us, and over to you now.
Thanks so much, Julia, for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity of sharing some thoughts this afternoon about the right to green space. And I guess for me, the challenge we face is this, that the evidence base for the health and well-being benefits of contact with nature and access to green space is, I think, overwhelming. And yet we're still missing the national political leadership that we need to give the agenda the priority it deserves. There's lots of warm words about more and better green space, and yet they're not being translated into real action on the ground. So I believe that a new right to nature-rich green space is one proposal that could help. So today I'll talk about how this proposal came about, why I think it's so important, and why now is the time to really push for something seriously ambitious. And then I'll end by highlighting some of the opportunities to put this new right to a green space into practice. So even before coronavirus, we knew that access to green space and nature was painfully unequal. People in poorer areas, those from communities of colour, tend to have less green space nearby. And we also knew that both adults and children were spending less time outdoors and potentially losing touch with our natural world, just at the same time that wildlife and ecosystems were being decimated. And my concern was and is that the less contact people have with nature, then the less likely they are to love it, to know it, and to protect it. So in late 2018, I commissioned an independent report to inform my work on nature in Parliament. And this report, A New Deal for Nature, was launched in the run-up to last year's general election. And I owe huge thanks to its authors, including Mark Cocker, Jeremy Minot, and Helen Smith. One of its key proposals was that, and I quote, "Access to wild green space must be considered a fundamental right for the British people." The report set out what this could look like, with ideas like pocket parks within 1 kilometre of every home, biodiversity net gain alongside minimum standards for ponds, reed beds, hedgings and village greens, and wildlife-friendly street trees for all new developments. And then the pandemic arrived. And the case, as Julia has said, for a right to a nearby patch of greenery where people could connect to nature, I think became stronger than ever. And the resonance of the idea was reinforced by another initiative that I was involved in. And it helps to answer the question, I think, of why a new right to wildlife-rich local green space is so important. And that project is the Reset Inquiry of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Green New Deal. And as part of this project, we spent the summer engaging with people right across the country on what a post-COVID society could and should look like. We heard from literally thousands of people, including those who traditionally are less likely to engage with processes like this. And a challenge maybe to the perception of the UK as nations riven with division, what we found when we asked people to look forwards was really common aspirations in all the communities with whom we engaged. And it was marked by an overwhelming public appetite for a fairer, greener, kinder Britain after COVID. And in particular, we found that people around the country valued time in green space enormously, especially during lockdown. They wanted more green space and they wanted more time to spend in it. A third of people in Britain and more than half of all Londoners made more use of local parks and green spaces during lockdown. And even where people didn't leave their homes, they reported spending time on balconies, for example, or watching birds through windows. So now I think is the right moment for us to be seriously ambitious about this agenda, to dramatically improve the access to and quality of green spaces, and to campaign for nature-rich green space to become a fundamental human right. Now, as everyone knows, there's a hard-won and well-developed international framework of human rights. But what seems remarkable is the complete absence from it of our natural environment, especially given what we know today about the fundamental dependence of humans on nature for our health, for our food, for our economies, for our well-being, and more. And that's why it was so inspiring to see a new global campaign launch 6 months ago, a campaign to make a healthy, natural environment a human right. It was spearheaded by BirdLife International, and it calls on the UN explicitly as part of its response to coronavirus to add a new Article 31 to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this new article would enshrine a universal right to a healthy natural environment, guaranteed by public policies, governed by sustainability, and informed by scientific and traditional indigenous knowledge. Now that is what I would like to see adopted by the UK government. Now we hear a lot about their aspirations to be a global leader on the environment. This is an opportunity for them to demonstrate their serious, to put those fine words into action by taking these steps here at home as a first step via the adoption of a new right to a healthy natural environment in the UK. Would that make the UK an outlier? No, not at all. According to the UN, over 100 countries have already granted the right to a healthy environment constitutional recognition and protection. The UK is not among them. And what difference would it make having a right to local green space in addition to other legislation? Well, I think one benefit would be that it would properly reflect what we now know about the links between mental and physical health and our environment on a local and individual basis, yes, but also on a community, societal and global basis as well. And I think we can draw some inspiration here from all of the excellent work done on the campaign for a right to food. Now, whilst the right to food differs in that there's already protection under international law, there's a strong movement right now here in the UK to put it in law here as well, with Scotland leading the way right now. By putting the right to green space into law, I think there'd be a stronger impetus for government departments, public institutions and local authorities to give green space the priority it deserves. I think it would help stop nature being this kind of optional extra if, for example, some less scrupulous developers threaten to pull out of a development unless green infrastructure requirements are diluted. It would also help establish, I think, a strong sense of purpose for the planning system and for the multiple and complex policy decisions that affect green spaces and the humans and wildlife who benefit from them. It would help ensure that all people, regardless of their gender, their race or their age, are able to benefit from green space and contact with nature. And another important parallel with the Right to Food campaign, I think, is the potential for a more integrated approach rather than one that is siloed across departments and that fails to tackle the underlying causes of either human inequality and ill health, or the relentless destruction of nature. And there's the question, of course, about the best process for how we develop this new right to green space and precisely what we would call it. Is it a right to access to nature? Is it a right to wild green space, a right to a healthy natural environment, or something else? And that to me is something that must be developed not just with legal and policy experts and practitioners, but with the involvement of the public too. Now, the proliferation of citizens' assemblies at a local level, as well as the National Climate Assembly UK, I think are sparks of a better democracy burning bright, and perhaps we could use a new citizens' assembly in this area too to help us develop the policies and the processes in this area. So turning finally back to Westminster and the opportunities ahead to build support for a new right to green space and to secure specific changes along the way, I was going to highlight maybe 5 opportunities that I think are ahead. And the first one will be very well known to all of you here, which is the planning white paper and the legislation that will follow it. I've recently tabled an early day motion in Parliament on planning for health and well-being. It was drafted, as some of you may spot, with the help of the TCPA and also with input from the CPRE. And it calls on the government to put democracy, affordability, people's health and well-being, and a right to access to nature for all at the very heart of the planning reform process. It's early day motion number 903, so everyone in the UK, please lobby your MPs enthusiastically to support it. Second, there's the Environment Bill. Now this bill, as many of you will know, has already been missing for the last 200 days. It's been supposed to be going through the committee process, but somehow it just seems to have ground to a halt. But hopefully it will resume back in committee later this month. There's already a worrying list of areas where the bill needs major improvement. And one of these is indeed on green spaces. And as a starting point, I think it needs to include a requirement on the Secretary of State to set legally binding targets for access to nature and green space. Third, and just as importantly, there's the Treasury spending review and wider policies on economic recovery. And among other things, I think this should include significant annual investment in levelling up access to nature in our towns and cities so that every community can access green infrastructure, high quality green spaces, and the health and well-being benefits that they provide. We urgently need a cross-government, joined-up approach so that improvements to access to nature and wildlife restoration from one governmental budget line, one departmental budget line, aren't dramatically undermined or cancelled out by the spending of another department. And one example that comes to mind very easily is the £27 billion road building plan, which apparently is still going to go ahead, just to give one obvious example. Fourth, there's probably a whole raft of smaller changes that could help or hinder. Again, often they're ones which originate outside DEFRA. One example is the need for the government to rethink its plans to criminalise trespass. These plans could end up discouraging people from accessing the countryside at the precise moment where it should be the government's priority to make it easier for people to get outside and to enjoy nature. And finally, I think there's one big opportunity, and that is the opportunity to genuinely reset our relationship with the natural world. A new right to a healthy natural environment speaks, I think, to this broader imperative, and it's one reason why it's such a powerful proposal. And it requires the government to replace the current economic model, obsessed as it is with GDP growth, with something better, something that gives us a much clearer idea, a much better idea of whether or not well-being is increasing or decreasing than GDP. We need to replace GDP, I believe, with a different set of indicators that shows whether or not we are protecting and restoring nature and respecting planetary boundaries. And one opportunity to really build on that idea, I think, is to make the most of the Treasurer's own Dasgupta review into the Economics of Biodiversity, which is expected next month. You'll know that the Treasury commissioned this review by Professor Dasgupta, looking at the value of biodiversity. We've already seen his interim report, and it's pretty powerful stuff. It says, for example, that economies are embedded within and not external to nature. I think just that simple observation, if that was actually enshrined at the heart of government, could make a massive difference. Professor Dasgupta goes on, unlike standard models of economic growth and development, placing ourselves and our economies within nature helps us to accept that our prosperity is ultimately bounded by that of our planet. This new grammar is needed everywhere, from classrooms to boardrooms, from parish councils to government departments. Now, I appreciate that that is a subject for a whole other event that maybe the TCPA might host one day in future. But I'd argue that a new human right to a healthy natural environment is one pretty good way of implementing that new economic approach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. That was a really fantastic start, so thought-provoking, but also with some very practical things that could be done to take this forward. I am delighted now to move on to our next speaker. In fact, before I introduce Helen, just to remind you in the audience, because I notice the numbers are going up as we speak, if you would like to ask a question, and we hope you will, please use the question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen. And we will collate the questions and put them to the speakers at the end after they've all spoken. But feel free to ask questions at any point, so just put them in the question and answer button. So moving on, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome our next speaker, Helen Griffiths. Helen is the Chief Executive of Fields in Trust and has been since 2013. She represents Fields in Trust on the MHCLG Parks Action Group and is a regular commentator on issues relating to parks and green spaces. And I'm particularly pleased to have Helen here representing Fields in Trust because of the incredibly valuable work that they've done over the last few years to look at quantifying issues around green space, because for many years we had very, very little data. It was all guesswork, and that has changed immeasurably, and Fields in Trust have been very much part of that effort to ensure that we have some really robust data about parks, green spaces and green infrastructure. So Helen, welcome, and over to you now.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join today. I want to talk today about the purpose of the Greenspace Index, which Julia has kindly introduced for us. Next slide, please. And why, for us at Fields in Trust, the Greenspace Index, which is a barometer of publicly accessible parks and green space provision across the whole of Great Britain, is a really critical piece of data to guide our core work. And our core work is very much guaranteeing that communities have access to parks and green spaces in perpetuity. So it is in itself the delivery of that right to permanent access to parks and green spaces. And what the Greenspace Index is enabling us to do, really crucially, is trying to make sure that where we're delivering that intervention, we're making sure that that access is truly equitable. Next slide, please. So why is it important that access is equitable? Well, we've heard from Caroline already about how important it is that we recognise the true value to health and well-being of parks and green spaces. And there is an overwhelming, I would agree, amount of evidence to support that position now. And our own research demonstrates that the very key role that's played by parks and green spaces in both physical and mental health and well-being, shown here, the figures around reductions in GP visits alone total a saving of £111 million per year. And we know that the wellbeing value generated by frequent use of parks and green spaces, and frequent use in this research was just once a week. And I think that probably over the last few months, we've all experienced much greater usage of those local spaces, is generating a phenomenal amount of wellbeing value every year. The research that we conducted also showed that lower socioeconomic groups and BAME communities value parks and green spaces double and triple the average. And I think that's really important when we think about how those particular groups are therefore disproportionately impacted by either the under-provision of those spaces in local areas, or when those spaces, as a non-statutory function, are lost to development. Next slide, please. So that welfare-weighted methodology that we applied to our research revaluing parks and green spaces in 2018 is really relevant when we start to look in more detail about the issues around equity of access, which is so important to this wider conversation. I think that we now know from the ONS study that was published earlier this year that 1 in 8 people in the UK have no access to private gardens. And 37% of black people in the UK have no access to outdoor space compared to 10% of white people. Lower socioeconomic groups are 3 times less likely to have private gardens. So for those communities, the local park is the outdoor space that they can access regularly. It is absolutely vital. It's a democratic space where people can come together. And as we saw, and as the height of lockdown really emphasised, it's a lifeline for both the physical and mental health and well-being of communities. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, there was an awful lot of commentary about everybody being in it together. And I think that over the intervening weeks, we have seen that actually the experience of lockdown is very different depending on your circumstances. And if you are, like Rebecca quoted on screen, confined to a small indoor space with young children, then the real value of the hyper-local park or green space is incredibly important. Next slide, please. And this issue of equity of access to green space, I think, as both Caroline and Julia have already talked to, is really gaining traction. I think that in 2020, the commentary and agenda around parks and green spaces has never been so heightened for obvious reasons. But as Julia referred to, it's really worth remembering that until recently, there was very little centralised data on the variations in access to parks and green spaces across this country. The Ordnance Survey's publication of Open Green Space in 2018 provided the baseline for the kind of analysis that at Fields and Trust we wanted to undertake for a really long time, and actually facilitated the production of our first iteration of the Green Space Index. So for years, the question that we were most frequently asked as a charity that protects parks and green spaces in perpetuity and has done so for 95 years was, how many parks and green spaces are there across the whole of the UK? How many of them are lost? What number of them are under threat? All of these really pertinent questions to the trends surrounding our access to parks and green spaces and whether or not that access is equitable were pretty much impossible to answer in any coherent way. And so what we wanted to be able to do was build a robust data set that really demonstrates and tracks the changes over time to our access to parks and green spaces, and looks at where those national and regional differences might be year on year. And that has very much been enabled by the production of the Open Green Space Map in 2018. And it's something that has also, in addition to the Green Space Index, really supported colleagues across the sector in beginning to analyse the quantity and quality of green space provision against other factors. So some great work done by the Ramblers and Friends of the Earth earlier this year that builds on that position, and I think is really helpful to inform the overall picture of where we have issues around access and where that is, as a social justice issue, really impacting on certain groups. Next slide, please. So the Greenspace Index, as a tool for us that's very publicly available on our website, really enables us to quantify what the overall provision is of parks and green spaces across the whole of Great Britain. And it lets us dig down into the detail of where there is inequity of access. So the headline picture is that there are 215,000 hectares of green space provision across the whole of Britain, which is the equivalent of just less than 33 square metres per person if we were to allocate a patch to everybody. What it also tells us, which I think is really important in the context of this conversation and what we've all experienced over the past 6 months and are likely to continue to experience, is the fact that 2.7 million of us live further than a 10-minute walk from a park or green space. And that's really important as we look at the need to be able to use our local neighbourhoods and the value of our local neighbourhoods during these restrictions and beyond. And importantly for us as an organisation, we can now allocate and analyse, from the Green Space Index exactly how much of the current provision of parks and green spaces are legally protected by Fields in Trust. So as an organisation, our core work is protecting parks and green spaces in perpetuity, in partnership with local authorities and other landowners. And the reason we do that is to try and ensure that future generations will also have that same guaranteed right of access to parks and green spaces. So right now, only 6% of all spaces in Great Britain are legally protected. And as a non-statutory provision, we know that that future can sometimes be vulnerable to development and budget pressure, and the overall position for provision going forward could look very different if lots of that green space turns to grey over time. So they're the headlines from a national perspective, and if we can move on to the next slide, we'll see that there are, as you might expect, some significant variations across the piece. So the Green Space Index is predicated on our own benchmark standard of adequate green space provision per person. That standard's been around for a long time, initially created as the 6 acre standard, and it's currently used by about 70% of local authorities to help plan the provision of sufficient sport, play and recreation space for their communities. So that's the standard that we use when we're measuring how much, measuring the Green Space Index and the provision across the country. And you can see here on the chart that currently Wales, Scotland, East and the Southeast of England all exceed that minimum standard. Whereas, and the West Midlands and the Southwest are just on the precipice. But in the second year of the index, we also started to do some additional work looking at future population projections. And we now understand that in 20 years' time, by 2040, there will be even fewer. Only 2 regions in the UK will continue to meet or exceed that target. And the next slide, please. So the data tells us a lot of stories that we need to interpret. As I said, across Great Britain, almost 2.7 people live more than 7 million people live further than a 10-minute walk from a park or green space. And as you would expect, a lot of cities perform relatively well against that benchmark. In dense areas, there may be a reasonable amount of provision. But what we need to look at, in addition to the proximity to the space, is whether or not we've got a sufficiency of provision. So if we've got one individual green space serving a very, very dense population, then it's even more important that we future-proof the existence of those spaces and we think about how we can create more green space in that local environment. So none of the indicators on their own is the full picture, and we need to look at it across the piece. And now, if we can just move on to the next slide, I just want to spend a couple of minutes looking at some specific examples. And focusing particularly on areas where we understand that parks and green spaces are going to continue to be a lifeline as stricter COVID-19 restrictions come into play, and also taking a look at Caroline's wider constituency. We can see here that Greenspace index score of 1, and we can see how Bradford, Brighton Hove, Glasgow City and Liverpool are falling short of that overall minimum standard, and are also falling some way short of the Great Britain wide score. But it's not just as simple as looking at what the score looks like across the piece. So if we move on to the next slide, by drilling down into the detail, we can really begin to see how uneven the picture is even within cities. So on the Greenspace index score map, you can see that here in Liverpool, which has a Greenspace index score of 0.73 out of 1, that the majority of the city still falls below that minimum standard, which isn't necessarily what you would expect from the score point. Now, we know that poverty drives substantial health inequalities in Liverpool, and an above average amount of households are flats. Most people in Liverpool are within a 10-minute walk of a park or green space. And as I said before, that means that going forward, the pressure in those densely populated areas to make sure that those spaces continue to exist is really, really crucial. In Liverpool, on the far right map that you can see, there is one green space that has been protected in perpetuity. So that's just 0.32% of the total green space provision in Liverpool that has that permanence of protection going forward. And our predictions say that there will be a 9% decrease in that score over the next 20 years based on population increase alone. So even if we were to retain every bit of green space that exists now, we would still be seeing an eradication of achieving the optimal level of green space access for the population there. If we move on to Glasgow City, then the picture is very different. The provision per person is on a par with Liverpool. It's at that same level, below the minimum standard, but by no means the lowest that we've seen across the country. But those high level provisions are much more evenly distributed throughout the whole of the city. The lower socioeconomic groups in Glasgow is significantly above average, and 70% of households are flats, which is the highest outside of London. And so that really demonstrates that need for preserving access to outdoor space. And one of the positive things to be able to show from this slide is the real number of the percentage of Glasgow's green space portfolio that is protected in perpetuity. So 27% of Glasgow's parks and green spaces are protected in perpetuity. And moving on to the next slide, we've got Bradford, which has a much lower green space index score of just 0.44. So not meeting even 50% of the recommended minimum standard of parks and green spaces. And the vast majority of the city is falling outside of that greater than minimum standard provision. We don't see the distribution in quite the same way. Over 7,000 people in Bradford live more than a 10-minute walk from a park or green space, and there is a limited level of protection that has been enacted thus far. And finally, moving on to Brighton and Hove, where 50% of households are flats, so 2.5 times the national average. But less than 400 people in Brighton and Hove are more than a 10-minute walk from a park or green space. So there are high levels of provision in terms of access on a local level, even though the green space index score is 0.36. And again, that kind of reinforces that point that these existing spaces and the pressure on those spaces will increase over time. And we really need to give consideration to how we ensure access, not just now, but in the future, and future-proof those spaces that do exist and create new spaces where possible as the population grows. Next slide, please. So what does all this tell us, and why is it important to this conversation? Well, parks and green spaces, as we know, and as Caroline has set out so eloquently, are linked to the wider determinants of health and inequality. And the protection of local green space contributes in the long term to preventative health, a better environment, a more active nation, more cohesive communities, help to combat loneliness. All key public health and social policy goals that have become even more at the top of the agenda in the past 6 months, I think, than they were before. So access to parks and green spaces should be equitable, and it should be guaranteed not just now, but in the future. And it's the responsibility, we say, of civic leadership to ensure that that is the case. Over the last 6 months, we've seen the value of parks and green spaces close to home more than ever. And our focus now at Fields in Trust is finding a way to combine this data with those wider indicators to determine where parks and green spaces can really make the most impact on community health and well-being, and working collectively across the sector with policymakers and with stakeholders to embed the concept of future-proofed parks and green spaces within a 10-minute walk of home. And in conclusion, I would encourage you all to go onto our website and have a look at the Greenspace Index apps for your particular area and really see how it performs in terms of the minimum standards and the amount of space that is protected against the rest of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. That was incredibly useful. It's always good to have facts and figures and to form the basis of discussion and thinking. So really valuable contribution to this afternoon's webinar. Just to remind you, do keep asking questions. They're coming in. So use the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we will put the questions to the speakers after our final speaker this afternoon, who is Trina Linsky. I'm really pleased that Trina could be with us today because she's sort of wearing two hats. She has a hyper-local role as chair of Deptford Folk, which is a park user group in southeast London, and under her leadership, Deptford Folk have secured significant funding to enhance parks and green spaces in one of London's most deprived areas. Her other hat is that of a commissioner on the London Green Spaces Commission, which recently published a report, which I'm sure Tina will mention. And Trina's background is in Sure Start, and she campaigns to ensure that all children have access to high quality opportunities to play and learn outdoors. So Trina, welcome. Do switch on your camera and over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Trina Linsky. I'm an early years education consultant and somehow fell into parks. My background is in Sure Start children's centres. My approach is always child-centred. I think this works for everybody. If you build a city that meets the needs of children, you will build a fairer and more accessible city for everybody. I'm also chair of a park user group called Deptford Folk based in southeast London, which happened because we were challenging plans to develop our local park and exclude people from using certain parts of it. And for the last 18 months, I've been a London Green Space Commissioner for the Mayor of London. Next slide, please. One of the things that struck me when hearing evidence as a Green Space Commissioner was the acknowledgement that green space has an important role to play in public health. Poor health outcomes are a huge and costly burden for the NHS, and that is a basic economic reality. But this hasn't translated into increased funding or the progressive policy that we need around green space. So as a starting point, having a right to green space would start to change this. Next slide, please. Access to the commons is not a new idea, and the best ideas we have are often old ideas. The 1217 Charter of the Forest gave the common man access to the forest. The forest back then was all kinds of heathlands and grazing and hunting. And the commoners needed the forest because it was essential to their health and well-being. They needed it for health, sustenance, and their mental, physical health. And that's the same for all of us today. The parameters are different as to why we need parks and green spaces, but we need them for our health and our well-being. Next slide, please. Another part of our common shared history and values in this country and in Ireland as well, where I'm from, is the Enclosure Acts of the 18th and 19th century, the removal of poorer tenant farmers from land and mass immigration to the city, and the acknowledgement of the fundamental connection between land and the development of Britain's public parks and gardens. So that happened as people moved to the city. There was a big movement to develop parks like Victoria Park in London to benefit those communities that had no direct connection to the land as they were now city dwellers. And we need to have that history and common shared purpose to continue now for communities that are very separate from the land that sustains them. Next slide, please. This is a quote from 17th century diarist John Evelyn. Air quality was as serious back then as it is now, and Evelyn recommended to combat this issue with air quality by planting trees and shrubs. And he said the people of London are haunted in their daily business by a dreadful smoke that causes many health problems, and still relevant today, sadly. Next slide, please. John Evelyn wrote about air quality, vegetarianism, gardening and trees. And he really was a man for our age, and he would have experienced pandemic too. He lived in Deptford, where I have chaired a park group for the last 4 or 5 years at Sayes Court. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about John Evelyn's neighbourhood as it is today. Next slide, please. This is the modern day Evelyn ward. It's in the very north of the borough, and this is where Deptford folk calls home. Poor air quality, low tree numbers, communities severed by busy roads, low car ownership, high population density, and a child poverty rate of about 49%, which is by far the highest in Lewisham and one of the highest in London. Most residents here will have no access to private outdoor space, which during lockdown meant everyone was in the park. It's also an area undergoing massive change. There's 17,000 homes being built in and around this area within a 10-minute walk of most residents. And this is homes, not people, so huge projected population increase. And importantly, in the bottom table there, you'll see that Lewisham need to find 13.7 hectares of green space just to stand still, just to meet the needs of the existing population, never mind the 17,000 homes about to be built. Next slide, please. So here are 3 of the massive developments. There's about 7,000 other than this, but these are the 3 right on the borders. So Canada Water to the north, Convoy's Wharf to the west, and New Bermondsey to the east, each with 3,500 homes. Again, homes, not people. Well, you will see the green spaces that are for these new communities are the existing green spaces. So the green circles on the map show how the developers have appropriated existing space to meet the needs of their populations. This is a modern form of enclosure, a removal of our rights to the forest. It's an invisible, insidious creep that reduces the amount of available green space per person. And Caroline Lucas referred earlier to a legally binding target, and this is why it matters. Without those targets, existing green space becomes everybody's green space, and it removes everybody's right to more. Next slide, please. The recommendation of every person being 10 minutes from green space is a great start, but in most urban areas, this will be met easily. The quality of that green space and the journey and route used to get there is as of equal importance. Is this playground good enough? I don't think so. Is this bit of park green? Is this access to green space as we would think it in our heads? And policy needs to ensure additional funding to ensure this ongoing quality of green space, and that if we're going to allow development to do what they're doing in places like Deptford, that the existing green space improves. Next slide, please. Another section of the Green Steps Better report, which it's not for discussion today, but it's the Safer Streets, Cleaner Air section. And I think this is really important when we talk about green space. Early on, when we founded Deptford Folk, we changed our generic constitution that most park users will have to include not only the parks, but the routes used to access them. Busy roads and poor accessibility, unsafe crossings can restrict people's access and accessibility to green space. You might be able to plot it on a map that someone is 10 minutes from a green space, but if that is a very miserable journey that's dangerous, unsafe, or inaccessible, it doesn't count. So let's not forget those space around council estates too, that often gets left off the funding of green spaces, where the older council estates, which are under threat from infill development, and this needs to be protected too. Next slides, please. At a local level, communities know what needs to be done. Too often, national and local government policy has inbuilt inflexibility, a one-size-fits-all approach to deliver the same in rural areas as it does urban. In Deptford Folk, we planted 200 trees in 2018 to celebrate 200 years since the publication of John Evelyn's diaries, and we won a 3 Oscar for this. But these hyper-local projects are really important. Hundreds of children from local schools and on planting day came out and planted trees. And what's really lovely is they still check on their trees. They have that connection with nature. And many parents said that they had never planted a tree as a child. And if you don't plant a tree as a child, you'll have lost that opportunity to do so. So these small projects that can be done on very little funding are often overlooked for grand schemes. Another project we are currently doing is our £2.9 million Livable neighbourhood project. Our TfL funding is currently paused, but last year before the pandemic we closed a horrible rat run on a school route at Prince Street, and it turned it into the most magnificent place through lockdown, where the local pub was able to operate and maintain itself as you know, a business. And it's where our children can now travel to school safely. And as the months have gone on, it's become greener and nicer, and any effort to reverse it would probably be met with a lot of opposition within the local community. It's a tiny section of road, and it is these cumulative effect of tiny local interventions which will knit together to make a greener, fairer city. Next slide, please. So to finish, protecting parks and green spaces is about protecting rights. Maintaining increases in population with increases in green space and increased quality is a matter of social and environmental justice. And if we don't tackle this problem of development and the reduction of green space by virtue of reducing people's individual access to the amount of green space available, we will not be able to sustain our public health or be able to ensure everyone's right to access to green space. And that's it.
Thank you, Trina. That was fantastic and really great to have a hyper-local view of what can be achieved and how incredibly important it is. And I think your comments about increasing densification and developers using existing green spaces to as part of the development without actually contributing any more was really well made. So we've had 3 very different but really pertinent and rich in detail presentations. I think lots of agreement there, but also an enormous number of challenges. So I'm very pleased that we've got lots of questions. Some of them look very difficult questions, but that's good. We've got some, I'm sure we've got the brain power to tackle them. I'll hand over to my colleague Jack, who's going to put some questions to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. And thank you to our speakers for some really great presentations. We've got quite a few questions to get through, so thanks for the questions, and I'll start quickly. So firstly, we've got a question for Caroline. How do you consider access to nature should be measured to assess performance against targets? So access can represent many different things to different people, to different groups, and proximity is not necessarily a good proxy for access.
Thanks, Jack. I think that's a really good question. And luckily, it's a question which I think both Helen and Trina have touched on in their presentations as well, because, you know, Trina rightly reminded us that in terms of a proxy, then access alone isn't enough if your access is over a 6-lane highway or something, and it's pretty impossible to get there if you if you had a pram or if you had lots of shopping or anything else. So I think you're right to challenge the idea about how easy will it be to identify what the right assessment measures are. I think in terms of new developments going forward, so leaving aside for the moment the more thorny issue of retrospective application, but I think looking ahead, it wouldn't be too difficult maybe to put together some kind of assessment that was based on a combination of the quality of the space that we're talking about, and not all green space is equal, the accessibility of it, as Trina pointed out, and distance and proximity as well. So I imagine you could have some kind of cumulative indicator that was based on those things. In terms of doing it retrospectively, obviously that's an awful lot more difficult, but at the same time incredibly important, because again, as the other speaker said, when developers see a bit of green space in an urban setting that would have quite a high value if they were to build on it, they are very minded so to do, and then we lose the green spaces that we already have and which existing homes depend on for their well-being. And so doing that, I think, will be a lot more complicated. I mean, obviously, partly the local planning system can help designate green spaces to make sure that they don't get eaten up through the development process. But I think in terms of enshrining the right in quite such a retrospective way would be probably harder. But I would love to see what Helen and Trina make of this, not least because Helen, I know, showed us quite a lot of different ways of measuring access, and she's probably thought about it longer than I have. So I wonder if she might like to help me out on this one.
Yeah, I think it is about, as you said, it's kind of finding a cumulative point that takes into account an awful lot of factors when we're looking at this, because it's never going to be binary. We're not going to have just a very straightforward answer to something that can be quite complex. And I think that one of the ways of looking at that implementation process is seeing how the new green infrastructure standards that are being developed by DEFRA as part of the 25-year environment plan that feature parks and green spaces obviously very, very highly, how that can, I think what we've been advocating for through the Parks Action Group and our role as chair of the standards of the Parks Action Group work stream is really looking at how provision and quality as a kind of threshold for each could be set out, because you're absolutely right. We can have provision of green space and we can have proximity of green space, but if it's very, very poor quality and nobody wants to use it, we're not increasing anybody's access to green space overall, because no one's going to want to go and use those spaces. And I think that does become, with the kind of the quality of provision issue, becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy at times, where it becomes slightly easier, for want of a better word, to infill and develop those areas that are slightly unloved and haven't had enough investment in them. And it just becomes part of a vicious cycle where we see that parks and green spaces are redeveloped for other purposes because allegedly they're not wanted by the local community, but the reasons that they're not wanted are much more complex than people just not wanting to go and use them. There are those barriers to entry. There's some really good work being done by a task group that's been set up by DEFRA, looking at equity of access to green space, that is looking at this from a social justice perspective and thinking about all of the groups that right now we know are not benefiting sufficiently from the health and wellbeing benefits that parks and green spaces specifically bring. And it is looking at parks and green spaces in terms of access to nature, because of that being the piece that is most usually on people's doorsteps, or at least relatively close to doorsteps. I'm not sure if that's helped you out, Caroline, but that's my...
It definitely helped me out, yes.
Thank you. Trina, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about, Caroline, your experience as a councillor and an MEP and an MP might be useful here. If green space were to become a right and it was enshrined as a UN right, or in the UK in some way, I wonder what impact that would have on local and national government, local councillors particularly. At the moment, and this came up in the Green Space Commission a lot, parks aren't statutory. And so when you have to meet your statutory requirements as a council, you have to take money from somewhere, and often parks are the poor cousin here. And once they become enshrined as some sort of right, there'll be an expectation to deliver in the same way that we have children's rights or other kinds of rights. I wonder if it would actually be really positive that and put it on the map for particularly local government, because I haven't found, despite how important green space is to people and parks, that it's a priority for a lot of local government. Yeah,
that's a really good question, and I think although it sounds like we're talking about something at a national or even an international level, it is actually at the local level where those decisions are being made, most regularly and most acutely. And I do think that if those decisions were being set within the overall context of a legal right, it would concentrate the minds rather wonderfully of councillors and council officers and others who are having to make decisions, and at the minute can't give maybe the statutory significance that they would like to green space and so forth. And I think this would give more power to their elbows to enable them to do that. I mean, of course, this conversation isn't happening in a vacuum, and we know that the planning white paper, unfortunately, is probably going to reduce the opportunities for councillors and indeed the public to lobby their councils in order to be able to make these decisions. And so perhaps actually even paradoxically, it's even more important that we try to get this enshrined at a legal level, at a macro level in a way, because we're losing, unless we manage to fight back really hard, we're losing some of the opportunities at a local level to be able to set these in stone there.
Right, thank you for that. Moving on to a question for Helen. The economic case for investment in green spaces couldn't be clearer. Have you seen, or are you beginning to notice, an increase in action towards improving green space provision at the local level, particularly since the beginning of the COVID-19 lockdown, or is it too early to say?
I think it's quite early to say in relation to COVID-19. I think that the business case for parks and green spaces is incredibly compelling. I mean, I think as a sector, we talk a lot about the fact that we don't really need any more evidence to be able to prove the fact that parks and green spaces are good for our health, for our well-being, for our environment, for our economy, for, as I said, a whole range of different public social policy goals. I think that the difficulty is directly related to the previous point, in that as they're not a statutory function, it's not that there isn't a will from local authorities to provide parks and green spaces. You know, they're all very proud of the parks and green spaces that they do have, that they can fund and invest in, and local authorities primarily know that parks and green spaces are usually one of the highest rated services that they provide. It's the thing that their constituents and residents really, really value. So I think that's very, very well known and well regarded by certainly by the practitioners that we speak to, and they're in a position where they would love to do more, but when they have, as Trina said, you know, other statutory duties that they need to fulfil, and there isn't the leadership that is forcing the issue for parks and green spaces to be a cross-departmental issue, that really kind of lets down how much action can take place at local level. So one of the things that the Parks Action Group works towards is trying to get a cross-departmental approach to unlock funding for parks and green spaces, because where we know they contribute across all of those different areas of public policy and have the opportunity to, you know, to save money further upstream, that's not being recognised in the funding that's going into them on the ground, and I think that's really difficult. I think in the immediate term, then the economic position for parks and green spaces is probably looking pretty poor. You know, we know that local authorities are going to see significant budget cuts coming down the line, and even though they've had this, you know, massive spike in use of parks and green spaces over the summer and during the restrictions, which obviously was not without its problems, because that increase in use meant that there was an increase needed in maintenance and services and ensuring that they were fit for purpose. Now my concern is that we will see, I think Trina used the word, the kind of the poor relation, the poor cousin. Parks will go back to the back of the queue for funding as we go forward, unless we really get that leadership and enshrine that position that they should have, not just as parks and green spaces, but as the assets that demonstrate so much for our communities.
Thank you, Helen. Next, a question for Trina. Should local authorities have statutory green space per person, along with the 10-minute access standard you were talking about? Just to mention that Wickham Council, for example, requires 25% tree canopy cover for new developments. So, Trina.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for me, it would be amazing if parks were a statutory responsibility. I think what another interesting thing in the Green Space Commission, when we looked at where do parks lie in different local authorities, so commissioners went and spoke to different local authorities about where does their parks lie within their structures. Some, you know, so we asked local authorities to report back. Some had it in within environment, which seems normal. Some had parks under highways. Some had them under customer services. So there wasn't a standard across London even about whose kind of job it was to determine where parks were. And so when you it'll be swayed by which department it's in. So for me, you know, I look at it and I wonder if highways is a good place. There's a lot of people's journeys will take them through parks. And then I think, oh no, because then they'll turn them into roads if you get the wrong people into government. And then you think maybe they should be environment, but then you're talking about, you know, what purpose do they serve? And so I think one of the problems for parks is they, you know, I think in Croydon they're under public health, don't quote me, you know, because I think they meet all of those requirements. So they almost have a no location at the same time as being multi-locational, you know. So, and I don't think a separate parks department is necessarily useful either. So there's a lot of things when we talk about a right to green space, we talk about it being statutory. The structure seems to be a bit of a mess. Even in my own head, I can't work out where it should be. And that's why perhaps the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. So, you know, in different councils, you might, in different areas, even different wards, you might find, you know, for us here in Deptford, the parks are all very small and very hyper-local. Whereas in other places, you might have a huge, big park that a lot of people access. And I think that that's really different. How do you increase biodiversity in a very urban park? Much easier in a larger park. You know, tree canopy in some boroughs is very easy to do because it's a lot of random green open space. It's neither park nor ornament or whatever. But then you have huge tree planting programs like they have in Hackney, where they're trying to increase their canopy significantly. And then even that's not comparable because, you know, people look at what Hackney's doing and say, can't we have 5,000 trees a year or whatever they're doing? And those other boroughs will say, well, actually, they're starting from a very low base. It's easier for them. So across the piece, and I think Helen is probably a better person to know, how would you make parks statutory? And, you know, it's very difficult, I think, to work out how to do it. But yes, I think they should be statutory and get lots of investment.
Thank you, Trina. Next, I'm going to ask a question which is really directed at everyone, all the speakers. So there can be issues concerning the maintenance of green spaces, and therefore fear of adoption can be a barrier. So how can we reset green space to be an asset and not a liability? Who would like to go first? Would someone like to go first?
I'll go first, but only, yeah. I mean, it's a very good question. And I mean, it reflects a reality. It's true that if a council suddenly becomes responsible for something more, then there are concerns, as you say, in terms of the ongoing upkeep and the costs and so forth. And at a time, you know, over the last 10 years, we've seen local authorities have their budgets cut literally in half. And certainly, you know, in Brighton Hove, we've had to let some people working in the parks go, because if you're given the choice between that and, you know, mental health services for young people, it's very hard to make the other case. I mean, I'm not saying it should be hard in the sense that we've all been talking about how important green space is to health, but you can see the problem in that case. And I think we really need some creative solutions here, because at the same time as we've got green spaces where some local authorities, for example, may feel they don't have the resources to keep them up, we also have an awful lot of people who would love, you know, to have access to be able to help plant them, weed them, nurture them, care for them, you know, and finding a creative way of putting those two things in touch with one another can't be beyond the wit of all of us. You know, from a Green Party perspective, one of our policies is around a universal basic income, which will give people a basic guaranteed income so that they would be freed up to do some of the work that currently isn't formally paid, but which nonetheless absolutely needs to be done. So admittedly, that's a longer term answer to the question, but it does seem to me that somewhere in there needs to be more of a partnership between local authorities and communities, because lots of communities, as both Helen and Trina have said, absolutely love their spaces, and I feel sure would love to be more involved in them and have greater say over them if we can find a genuinely accessible and yeah, democratic way of doing it. You don't want just, you know, one set of people to kind of take over the park. So there are going to be issues about how you make it a space where everyone feels welcome and everyone feels that they can have their say. But I'm sure Helen or Trina must probably know of some good precedents in this area where we could really learn from where it's worked well and try to replicate that further.
I was part of a webinar recently about some work Bridget Snaith has done around inclusivity. Someone's put in the Q&A, Sophie Jones has talked about inclusivity, and it's worth looking at her work that she's done around the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park about improving BAME representation on things like park user groups. I'm a very typical park user group chair. It's probably one of the few areas where women are dominant, but we you know, the access and accessibility and how different communities use park is not as well understood as it should be. And I think that you know, often park user groups grow out of a threat to the local park, and everybody gets involved, and then it sort of dies away until the next threat is identified. And so it's sort of an expectation that your local park will always be there. So the community see it as an asset, somewhere you go with your children for play or with your nan for a walk. But for local authorities, I think it can feel like a liability. There's also a movement towards social prescribing, where GPs or whatever would prescribe more healthy opportunities to people rather than medicalization. But what it looks like to me so far, as I've been following it a bit, is that you'd be prescribed the activity, but there wouldn't be any money following with it. So you'd be asking people to join their local cycling club or whatever, but there wouldn't actually be any funding. So it's a bit of a displacement of a duty onto a voluntary sector. So that would be interesting to watch as well. But to turn it into a real asset for local authorities, it has to deliver. And for some reason, there's no traction on all the data that's been created by lots of these organisations who've shown that parks have an intrinsic economic value, but it doesn't seem to gain traction, because I don't know if the results are immediate. I feel it's very similar to Sure Start, which has been pulled away from under a lot of parents. It just didn't give the immediate benefit, but there were lots of stats about how £1 invested in Sure Start was a saving of £4 later on. And we have the same for parks, but we haven't been able to demonstrate it strongly enough at the heart of local and national government.
Thank you, Trina. Helen, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just briefly, thank you. I think that's right. I think it's about, I think it goes back to that leadership point, and where there is a will for funding to be directed into parks to be able to deliver on different agendas, which can help offset this idea that a park is a liability. So, you know, it's looked at on the, you know, on the balance sheet as such, and you know, I think we need to kind of try and break that down. And I know that that's very much supported by a lot of practitioners, in the sector. I think that the kind of that trend away from local authorities being keen to adopt further land within new developments because of that maintenance liability presents a further inequity problem further down the line, because we will end up in a situation where we've got developments that are, you know, that have green space within them, but it's privately used. It's only used by those particular homeowners. It doesn't have that same democracy of space that we expect in terms of parks and open spaces. And so I think finding a solution that brings the, you know, that keeps that public realm element of parks and green spaces is really, really important. And part of that needs to be achieved by seeing those different ways where parks are being utilised to, you know, to achieve other agendas like green prescribing, that there is sufficient funding supporting that, that it's not just a displacement exercise as Trina referred to. And also that there's been a lot of amazing work done by the Parks Accelerator programme over the past few years, funded by Heritage Lottery and National Trust, where income generation models for parks have been proved to be incredibly successful. And I think there's a lot of value in it, you know, in finding the opportunities where that works. But there's also a bit of concern in thinking that it will be a one-size-fits-all. You know, not every park is going to be able to do that, and not every community has the social capital around it to be able to step into, you know, to fill the gap. And so it's important that we don't see that as a, you know, as a fix-all for parks and green spaces, because that will just further the inequity of provision and particularly of quality, I think, that can happen.
Thank you, Helen. Next, I suppose this is a question for Caroline. Rishi Sunak spent some time as Parks and Greenspace Minister. Is it naive to hope that this may provide an opportunity for promoting pro-Greenspace activity one day?
Caroline, you're on mute.
Oh.
Sorry, I was going to say, I certainly wouldn't bet your house that that there would be a direct correlation in terms of his experience working in this area and then finding the money to support it and to be a loud voice for it in Parliament. I mean, I think in a way that is why, you know, some of the work that we were doing over the summer, as I described with this Reset project, was so important, and it does echo lots of the research that many other groups have done about the importance to people's well-being of green space. And I think it kind of speaks to the debate we've just been having, really, as to whether or not green space is a liability or an asset. Because if we want to make sure that in budget making, as we have it coming up, that we don't get more cuts to local authorities and more cuts to green space, then there needs to be a really sort of cross-party, you know, cross-sectoral campaign around saying why green space isn't just a sort of a nice to have for those who can afford it, but is an absolute lifeline for everybody. And, you know, assuming that that COVID is going to be with us for a while yet to come, then that access to green space is only going to get more important for people. So I think it's going to have to come down to an awful lot of loud voices campaigning together in a joined up way to make this point really strongly, that on so many different indicators, green space, you know, ticks the box and is indeed an asset, not a liability, whether that's your health, your well-being, you know, the sense of community and nature in its own right. So yeah, I suppose my message is don't sit back on your laurels. I think we've still got our work cut out for us. But at the same time, you know, we've also got a government that wants to see itself as a leader on the environment, and that's positive. And if we can really make this something that, you know, there is political capital for the government to see itself as a leader in this as well, then that has to be a good thing. I mean, it could start with cancelling the £27 billion road building plan and probably scrapping HS2 into the bargain. But on a more local level, we definitely need government and local authorities to be the champions of this.
Thank you, Caroline. Next, a question for Helen. Does Green Spaces for Good have a model supplementary planning document or a recommended best practice of existing local policy that councillors could push for local adoption?
Yes, we have a planning guide available on our website, which I mentioned before, is what the Greenspace Index is based on. So beyond the 6 acre standard, planning zone for outdoor sport and play sets out the requirements for provision across those different sport, play, recreation and amenity space, and the guidance for proximity to dwellings, the provision per population head, etc., that people should find useful, I hope, and should be easily accessible. There is also a document on our website that I meant to reference before called Watch This Space, which helps people from a community campaigns perspective guide their way through the planning process if they do want to object to a potential threat to their local park or green space. And I will attempt to post the links into the chat whilst we're talking, although I might fail on that, so I might follow up afterwards.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Next, a question for Trina. So as more office spaces in London potentially become redundant due to greater levels of home working, do you perhaps see an opportunity to replace vacant office buildings with public parks to improve access? If so, how might this happen?
You know, to remove an office building and turn it into a park, I mean, sure, why not? But I think the go with the easy option, for me, the easiest way to increase the amount of green space is to take over roads. There's so many half-dead roads where I live that could actually just be turned into green space. And we showed that on that tiny bit of road of Prince Street. And, you know, we really need to look at what our cities are going to do. If we we can't tell people to be more active if actually going out and being active is a miserable experience and it feels dangerous. We can't tell people with 3-4 kids to go to, to walk quite a distance to get to a decent playground. So the 15-minute neighbourhoods idea, for me, the 15-20-minute neighbourhoods, whichever camp you fall into, works. And, it's working in Paris, and it could work in London easily, but it takes a lot of guts to actually just do it, to turn around. And I think some of these big proposals, big things that have happened in London with restricting car use have perhaps been too big, and actually the really small incremental changes that we could see. So I would start with roads. Do we want to turn office blocks? I mean, yeah, I would create a lot more green space. Another green space that hasn't come up yet, but is really important to monitor, is what are called POPs, the privately owned public space. And this is places like King's Cross or Canary Wharf that develop parks, and I have a love-hate relationship with them. They're great to go and play in the water fountains or sit on their nice, soft, corporately managed grass. And, you can have a really enjoyable time there. But start being homeless, start having a drinking problem, start having an antisocial behaviour problem, you'll start to see that you'll be quickly removed from that space and you'll be sent somewhere else. And so local authorities have a difficult issue, because when a development says, oh, we will develop this park in the middle, we'll manage it, they think, oh, that's fantastic. We will have a new park. We can tell everyone have a new park, but you dig a little deeper and there's lots of rules and security around them. So there is some work, I know, in the GLA around that, about how we might manage that a bit better, because it's also not right that the local authority find that the residents who need the most support are excluded from those spaces, that there isn't an even spread, or that people can't enjoy a new Riverside Park because it's not really public.
Thank you, Trina. So the next question is one to all the panelists. How do we do all of these wonderful things that you've spoken about in our current political climate, where it's economics over ecosystems? Who would like to come in first?
Shall I start on that one? I mean, I agree with the premise of the question, that it's going to be an uphill battle. But having said that, then looking for places where we might be able to make some headway, then the review that I mentioned, this Treasury Dasgupta review into the economics of biodiversity, the government set quite a big store about this review and what it's going to say. And yet, as we can see from its interim report, it's going to say that nature is really, really important and has a massive value, and that a narrow obsession on economic growth and GDP is not delivering us the sort of the policies that we need right now. So I think we should be trying to identify those areas where there's a possibility of being able to make some progress and build on it. So, certainly speaking as someone who's sort of active at a national level, I think when that review comes out, then really giving it as much airtime and amplification as we possibly can will be important. But there are other things. I mean, there are things like the response to the planning white paper, and if we can get as many people as possible to write in and share their concerns around the sort of loss of democracy that is implicit in the planning white paper. I mean, the reason that I think there is some traction in that is because I think actually an awful lot of Conservative MPs, certainly backbenchers, are worried about this, and we've heard them speak out about it and so forth. So I think we need to sort of identify some areas where we can be going with the grain a little bit, where perhaps we're more likely to make some breakthroughs. There's the whole debate about biodiversity net gain, and personally I have some skepticism about it, because at its worst it just assumes that one piece of green space is totally interchangeable with another. But it might be that we can make that policy more robust and mean again that we're genuinely making a net gain. So yeah, my advice at the minute, faced with a government that isn't necessarily that positive about this agenda, would be to find those areas where there is some traction, and I certainly think there are some coming up.
Thank you, Caroline. Would Trina or Helen like to come in there? on that one?
The idea of consensus politics here is really, really important. You know, you've got to have a cross-party approach to it. And it's that kind of policy always works better in the long term, that it isn't a win for one single political party. I think there was a domestic violence bill that went through quite recently, which was a wide range of people representing not just different parties, but different parts of the country, who pushed forward this bill together. And that gives it a longevity into the future. And I think it's what did for Sure Start in the end, that it was too closely associated with one political party. I think that the Greenspace thing, it's really fundamental. And that's what I was trying to get across in my presentation. It's not recent, it's not new. You know, Greenspace has been really valuable throughout previous pandemics, ones that we don't have in our living memory. And way back, you know, it was recognized that this idea of people having access to green space is cross-party, it is cross-cultural. And I think that if we can get that idea across, that, you know, it's not, parks to me are something they're so deeply political, they are apolitical. And I think that they can deliver all of the things. With regard to the economy as well, you know, places across London during the pandemic now have shown we don't have much of an economy left in the city at the moment. Everyone's at home, but the restaurants, the cafes, the bar are really benefiting from additional outdoor space where people feel safer to sit and eat. And if we're going to support that and promote that, we need to start making more space, more public space. And once we start making that public space that's grey, we start to green it, and it becomes this progressive movement towards better green space. This isn't about big showboating parks, although I'd love to see more of that also. It's about, you know, a war of attrition against grey in our cities and making it safer and healthier and more equitable.
Thank you, Trina. Helen, would you like to come on that one, or?
And there's very little that I can add to that eloquent statement from Trina, but I think that there was a lot of activity in the sector. There was a lot of opportunity. There were a lot of things that were about to come over the line, it felt, you know, in terms of direction of travel and the pressure and the creation of a really compelling business case around parks and green spaces that was beginning to get some traction. And I think that we need to see the current situation not as an opportunity for all of that good work to be derailed, but as an opportunity that demonstrates just how powerful those spaces are. And I think that probably the advantage that we have now versus where we were this time last year is that the recognition at local community level has never been greater. And I think it's about firing people up and galvanizing that kind of community response that's needed to these spaces. I think that people didn't realize quite how much they loved their parks and green spaces until 6 months ago. They knew they quite liked them and they use them, you know, regularly, but the real value of them came to the fore during the first lockdown. And I think that's something that will stay with communities and something that they will, you know, that they will want to fight for, and something that, again, we need to reinforce the fact that most people don't know that parks are not a statutory function, so they don't know that they're vulnerable. And if we can try and kind of access that local activism that, again, community spirit and activism that has come to the fore over the last 6 months, then I think that's a really positive joint campaign, as Caroline said, for people to come together and try and really advocate and champion that value.
Thank you, Helen. I think we have time for one more question, but if I could just ask the panelists for very quick answers, because we've literally got 2 minutes. So in the process of improving equal access to green space, how do you think is the best way to avoid so-called green gentrification, where poorer communities are priced out of an area? Who would like to go first?
I can make a quick statement on that. I think there's a comment there as well about antisocial behaviour in parks as well. And what I will say, you know, and a lot of this comes down to things like street drinking or drug use. You know, I always find it interesting that people call these antisocial behaviour, and actually for the people who are doing it, it's highly social. Those kids that are on a park bench bothering you because they're loud are being really social. And that's a really important part of young urban culture, that they have places to get together, you know. So when we look at our parks and talk about pushing people out, I absolutely understand that. And I think it's really important that we understand the behaviours there. And, you know, every behaviour is somehow social. And so when we start to look at the reasons behind it and how we can support people and use our parks as places, you know, so people don't always have to go to some office, and maybe we have more people in our communities that are working with people. The pushing out of people is not the fault of parks. That's a housing issue. I'll leave that to parliamentarians to sort out. It's beyond my expertise. But, you know, making sure that we have mixed and equal communities is another part of the planning process. So watching this white paper go through will be really important for that as well.
Yeah, I think echoing that point, that idea of antisocial behaviour in parks is something that came up often during restrictions. We were on weekly calls listening to how people could resolve the issues of these people not using parks in the right way. And the question is, well, who defined the right way to use them in the first place? And these ideas of, you know, those barriers to access, I think, are really important, that we have that wide breadth of use, and that these places are welcoming and that they represent our communities. I think in terms of the that kind of green gentrification, then one of the reasons that we created the Greenspace Index was to look at where there is provision of green space, and then to drill down and look at who the communities are surrounding those spaces. And I think that we've got to look at it from a strategic perspective, consider those wider indicators, those socio-demographic indicators, and how investment in parks and green spaces in particular locations can deliver even greater health and wellbeing benefits than necessarily just the economic regeneration that parks and green spaces can help to promote. And across the portfolio of green space within any individual city, we can do all of those things because there is that, you know, that breadth and range.
I don't think I've got very much to add, except that I think that in terms of the kind of the governance, if you like, of some of these green spaces, then I think it needs to be as broadly based as possible, and that local communities themselves, you know best what they want to use their parks for. If we can find a way of hearing from not just those that speak the loudest and turn up to the public meetings, but find a much more participatory way of engaging with people that, you know, perhaps wouldn't normally go to a public meeting about something, but actually do care very deeply about this. So again, some of the things we've learned through citizens' assemblies and other ways of really kind of reaching out to different communities who share a space to make sure that there is some kind of equitable process of hearing all of those voices will be vital in terms of making sure that green space meets the needs of all the communities, because I think there's no doubt that all communities appreciate green space. There was a really interesting point that was put in the question and answers just now about how different ethnic communities might have different ways of wanting to organise that space and see it used and see it designed. And the more that we can ensure those voices are heard at the very beginning, then I think the better chance we'll have of ensuring that those spaces are well used, well loved, and done so in an equitable way.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. We're going to have to wrap it up there. So yeah, thank you very much to the audience for all of your questions. Some really good questions there. So yeah, I'm going to hand back over to Julia to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you very much, Jack, for fielding all those questions, and thank you to the audience. There's some really interesting, pertinent and quite difficult questions in there, which is good. Thank you so much to our speakers. You've all provided an incredibly rich and insightful perspective, or three different perspectives on this topic. I think there is some really good news, which is we know that parks and green spaces are hugely popular. One of the problems we've had so far is not only the lack of data about where parks and green spaces are, which is now, that's now been addressed. There's also been a problem about how we know if they're any good. What is a good quality park or green space? We've had the Green Flag Award for many years, and that's very successful. We now have Building with Nature, which is another standard. And in England, Natural England is bringing forward a suite of green infrastructure standards. And I think that's really, really going to help, because it's not enough to say we need to have a green space nearby. It has to be a really good one, and there has to be a way of assessing that. And that has to involve local communities. So there is a lot of progress going on. There's also the work of the Natural Capital Committee, which has helped us understand the multiple values of parks, green spaces and green infrastructure in a way that can now be put on balance sheets. So there's still the huge problem of how to fund them. So I'm going to suggest that we spend the 27 billion that should be spent on roads, on buying up old office blocks that won't be needed, turning them into parks, and freeing everybody to go and enjoy them. But before we wrap up on that slightly ambitious note, if you're interested in planting trees, do download our free leaflet. It's not aimed at arboriculturalists, it's aimed at councillors, city leaders, anyone who needs to know the basics of how to get it right. Sadly, there are some tree planting schemes that aren't working, and we want to make sure that they do work. So please have a look at that. Next slide, please. We've got another webinar coming up next week. We very much hope you'll enjoy it. Will enjoy it and will join us. The outlook for green infrastructure in Great Britain post-Brexit. We know that EU funding, EU policies have shaped green infrastructure in the UK for many years. What's going to happen after the 31st of December? So that should be a really interesting discussion. I do hope you can join us for it. I think we have one more slide, thank you. Today has been presented on behalf of the Green Infrastructure Partnership, which the TCPA manages. It's free to join. Do join. We can keep you in touch with all sorts of news, research, events, policy changes about green infrastructure across the UK. And do have a look at the Green Cities website. There's various resources and some great case studies there. So finally, I'd just like to leave us with two quotes from our wonderful speakers. Parks are so deeply political that they're apolitical. I think a brilliant point from Trina, thank you. And that we should be looking towards having a fairer, greener, kinder Britain after COVID. One from Caroline.